Okay, we're going to start. It's a great pleasure to have Margaret Roberts with us here today. Professor Roberts is a graduate from the Government Department of Harvard, which is a department of political science, and she has a degree in statistics from Harvard. Is now associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, and she studies how authoritarian regimes deal with information, and with a specific focus in China, and this is what we are going to hear about today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Roberts.
About my book, which is Censored, Distraction and Diversion Inside China's Great Firewall. This is sort of the substantive, oh yeah, I forgot to turn this on. I'm not used to that. This is sort of the substantive side of my research. This is the sort of how I apply data methods to understanding censorship in China and other authoritarian regimes. So I started studying censorship as a graduate student at Harvard, and the puzzle that always really just made me want to do more research is what I call China's censorship paradox. So the internet in China is kind of the place to be. The internet in China is this high volume, vibrant, really innovative space. So if you talk to anyone on Wall Street, all they want to know is what is the next hot Chinese internet company, and how can I invest in it early, right? So some of the hottest Chinese internet companies in the world are from China. There are hundreds of millions of people online in China. There are many different really interesting platforms for people to talk about. So Lu Wei, who is the former director of the State Internet Information Office in China, has this great quote where he says, in 2015, China has 4 million websites with nearly 700 million internet users, 1.2 billion mobile phone users, 600 million WeChat and Weibo users, and generates 30 billion pieces of information every day. So this is like this huge, really dynamic space. At the same time, the Chinese internet is also known for the most sort of extensive censorship system in history. So we know that the Chinese government controls the internet by jailing and intimidating social media users, blocking foreign websites from entering China with the Great Firewall, so making some websites not accessible from China, employing thousands of censors to individually remove posts off of the internet, and filtering and to search to remove or downweight search results, so asking search companies to change the order of search results that come to users. And also hiring government astroturfers to distract from ongoing events by spreading information online. And so I've done a lot of work in the past, and I think Gary King was here earlier talking about some of the work I've done on what exactly is censored online in China, or what exactly is done with online propaganda in China. But today, I'm going to really focus on this paradox, which is how can the world's sort of most dynamic internet space also be the one of the most heavy-handed regulation? So how do you get this really dynamic internet at the same time of having this really censored space? Why does the government try to censor something that a lot of people would think is kind of uncensorable? So 30 billion pieces of information every day. How do you parse that? How do you decide what to remove from that? And does censorship actually impact access to information? Why doesn't repression sort of force risk-averse consumers online? So how can you think about these two things, this dynamic internet space and the censored space, in the same breath? So one answer to this paradox is that just censorship doesn't work, okay? So this is an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal. The Great Firewall is ineffective. Almost anyone, including Chinese journalists, academics, and government officials, can bypass the censors and access foreign sources of information by using a virtual private network or a VPN. So one way you solve this paradox is you say, well, this vibrant internet space exists despite censorship because censorship just doesn't work, right? The other answer to this question, which is on the other extreme, is that fear purifies the internet. So some pundits, so this is a different op-ed that says, the Chinese society has moved to an era of self-censorship where people themselves automatically purify the internet. So you can have a dynamic internet space, but because everybody knows exactly where the line is, nobody ever crosses it, right? So this is the opposite answer to censorship doesn't work. It works so perfectly that we know it's purified, a purified internet. So the answer I put forward in the book is slightly different, is that censorship works, but it doesn't work through fear. It works through distraction and diversion. So it's sort of this middle answer between these two different extremes. It nudges, but does not force most users away from unsavory material. So I talk about in the book that censorship in China is porous. It's circumventable, like the first answer. So people can get around censorship, and they can access information that is off limits. But people, as we know in political science, we know that people are really busy, they're impatient, and sort of uninformed about politics. So for the most part, people around the world, not just in China, don't really care that much about politics and are not really willing to spend a lot of time to go search out that information. And because of that, they're very affected by censorship, especially when they can explain it away. So even though censorship is circumventable, they sort of aren't really willing to spend the time and effort to do that. This allows the government to then reserve blatant repression for high-profile social media users and media and academics. So for people who are willing to go search out that information and evade censorship. But censorship, for the most part, works through nudges with the masses, but it has this strategy has an Achilles heel, which I'll also hope to convince of you today, is that there are certain time periods, like sudden disruptions and crises, when people are willing, when your average user is willing to search out information, and they are willing to circumvent censorship. And these are often time periods when the government needs censorship most. So I'm going to try to convince you, for the most part, people are not willing to search out information and to evade censorship, and therefore are very affected by these nudges, but that there are certain time periods when this strategy backfires, okay? So after Lu Wei said, oh, China has 4 million websites, generates 30 billion pieces of information every day, he said, it is not possible to apply censorship to this enormous amount of data. Thus, censorship is not the correct word choice. But no censorship does not mean no management. And the government really takes this perspective that censorship is not about perfectly purifying the internet, but it's about nudging and managing information in a way that routes users to information that the government feels is more palatable. So I think that the reason why we often aren't really clear about how to solve this censorship paradox is in social science, we don't really have a theory of how censorship affects people. And in the book, I put forward a theory of what I think of as the 3 mechanisms of which people can be affected by censorship, okay? And to make them easy to remember, they all start with F, okay? So the first is fear. Fear is usually what we think about when we think about censorship. We think about there to be some punishment for saying or for reading something, and therefore people are deterred from reading or writing because of that punishment. But the problem with fear for authoritarian regimes is it must be observable in order to function. So you have to know that this punishment will happen, and then you have to decide not to do something because you know that, right? And therefore, it's really dangerous to authoritarian governments because it can cause backlash. So if I disagree with that punishment, I can decide that I don't like that government policy, and that can make me angry. It can also draw people toward information. So if you can't read this book, that's like the best way to get somebody to read a book, right, in certain cases. And so that observability can be a problem. And if it's too good, if fear is too effective, it can also create information gathering problems for governments. So if everybody is fearful to say anything, then the government can not know that there's some problem in the society that's easy to fix. And then you could have these sort of unexpected revolutions. So fear is a little bit of a dangerous strategy from a censorship perspective for an authoritarian regime. But the other mechanisms of censorship don't rely on observability in order to function. So friction, which is the second mechanism of censorship that I talk about in the book, instead of making certain information off limits with a punishment, it just makes information more costly to find and spread.
okay? It taxes information. So this does not have to be visible in order to be effective. If I go to a library and I try to check out a book and it's not there, I'm not sure whether or not it's the government that decided not to have the book in the library, or if the book just wasn't that important and therefore it's not there, right? Or if a web page is loading like a little bit more slowly, I'm not sure if the web page is just having some technical issues or the government's throttling it, right? And so friction as a mechanism of censorship relies on the indifference and impatience of people. So it relies on the fact that when you try to go to a web page and it's a little slow, that reliably you will switch to a different page because everybody is really impatient on the internet, right? Friction also separates out the masses from the activists. So friction, some people are willing to wait for that web page to load because they really want to see the information. And so there are certain people who are willing to get around friction, and those people care a lot, whereas the vast majority of people are sort of indifferent and impatient. So it separates out masses from activists, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And therefore, friction is really different from fear because it just puts small barriers but doesn't make information explicitly off access. And the last mechanism I talk about for censorship in the book is flooding. And this is introducing noise or distractions into the information environment in order to make other information sort of less important. So I argue in the book, this is also a form of censorship. It dilutes the information environment. It also does not have to be visible in order to be effective. You might not even notice flooding, and even if you did, you don't necessarily know what it's trying to distract from. And it makes separating out good and bad information harder. So if you think about the Russian government, if there's a protest and everyone's using a hashtag, they have been known to flood the hashtag with sort of miscellaneous information and makes it much more difficult to coordinate around that hashtag because there's all this random information now within that hashtag, okay? So that it makes sort of coming across this diluted information less likely. So the argument in the book is, well, porous, friction and flooding sort of maximize the impact and minimize the cost for authoritarian regimes. So even though it's easy to circumvent friction and flooding, because people are very affected by these small costs of access, they are rerouted easily, whereas fear sort of can sometimes draw people toward that information. So today, I don't really, this is sort of the overview of the argument, but today I don't really have time to go through all of the different data examples in the book. So I bring to bear a lot of different types of data to look at fear, friction, and flooding in the Chinese context. But today, I'm just going to focus in on one example to sort of show you how this works in China. So today, I'm just going to talk about the Great Firewall of China, which is one of many different censorship methods that the Chinese government uses. The Great Firewall of China blocks foreign websites from China. So from China, you can't access websites like Twitter, Facebook, Google, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg, Dropbox. There's a long list of websites that you get an error page if you try to access. You can get around the firewall, and especially in this data period that it was easier, in the data I'm going to show you, it was easier to get around the firewall than it is today. But you can evade it with a virtual private network, where you sort of, or a proxy, where you sort of log into a computer outside of the country, and then you can kind of see everything through that computer, if you think about it that way. But very few people do. So surveys show that anywhere between 3 and 15% of people have evaded the firewall, and I definitely believe the 3% number a little bit more, because the 15% is on online surveys, and like half of the people in China are not online. So this is probably an overestimate. Also, at the time of the data that I collected, and even today, for the most part, it's not illegal to evade the firewall. 3% of internet users, or 3% of the population. Yeah, the population. Yeah. Yeah, 15% I think is more on the internet user side, because those are online surveys. The 3% is more the face-to-face surveys. I believe the lower number more. Yeah. The Great Firewall is not illegal to evade. There isn't really a punishment for evading it, although there has been talk about making this happen. And so it's really a form of friction. You have to find the VPN, you have to download it, you have to pay some money in order to get around the firewall and to access websites abroad. Okay? So it's a form, it's inconvenient to do. So today I'm going to show you through some surveys, through using some social media exhausts, like things that we can kind of see online, and in doing so a little bit of text analysis to show you that, I try to convince you that the firewall is very effective. Very few people jump it. And I'll show you this just statically. I'll just do some descriptive statistics of how many people jump in and what those types of people are. But I'll also show you it through an interrupted time series. I'll show you that when websites are suddenly blocked, there's a big decrease in internet traffic to those websites from China, as you might expect. I'm also going to try to convince you that the firewall pulls capable, politically interested individuals away from the masses, so it creates different internet spaces. And I'm also going to try to convince you that there's an Achilles heel of the firewall and of this friction method. There are some time periods where it's less effective, like during crises or also during sudden censorship of websites with few substitutes. So there are some time periods when people are actually pulled across the firewall, and that this can backfire because then this creates a gateway to not just what they're pulled across for, but to other internet platforms. Okay? And this comes from this paper that I just published with Will Hobbs, who's a former UCSD PhD student, on how sudden censorship can sometimes increase access to information. Okay, so who jumps the wall in mainland China? So first I'm just going to paint you this descriptive picture, and then I'm going to try to show you that friction really does cause big changes in internet traffic. So I participated in a survey of 3,500 urban residents. So this is representative of urban residents in China in the summer of 2015. And 5% of people said that they jumped the firewall. Okay, so this is probably a number that's slightly higher than the whole China, where you would include both urban and rural residents, right?
Would they be afraid to admit it?
So yes, that could be the case. I think it's not the case because there isn't really a punishment for it, but I'm going to show you with social media data that I get about the same answer right after this. Yeah. So the types of people who say that they evaded the firewall are people who have more tools to evade censorship. So they tend to have higher proportion of a college degree than your average internet user. They have a higher family income on average than your average internet user, because they're more likely to be able to pay for a VPN. They're more likely to say that they speak English than your average internet user. They also have more expected benefits of evasion. So they're much more likely to say that they follow international politics than your average internet user. They're also much more likely to work at a foreign enterprise than your average internet user, which often includes having to use a VPN. And they're also much more likely to say that they have been outside of China, which includes, in this case, Hong Kong and Macau, versus your average internet user. So they're much more likely to have traveled more extensively. Okay? So they're a very different type of person than your regular person, your average internet user in China. They're also much more likely to be younger. So here in the x-axis here is age, and here on the y-axis is the proportion of people. And these are sort of the different answers you can give to this survey question. One is that people who don't use the internet, as you see, there are a lot of people especially who are older in China, who don't use the internet. A lot of people say that you don't know what the one option on the question is you don't know what the firewall is. A lot of people don't know what the firewall is. So it's very hard to jump the firewall if you don't know what it is, right? And then there are a lot of people who say they know about it, but they don't jump it. And then there are the people who tend to jump the firewall, people who are younger, who actually, when they went to college, the internet had already come to China. I think that's the big jump there. That's what's going on. So why don't people jump the wall? So if people answered that they knew what the firewall was, but they didn't jump it, there was a question about why not. And only 2% people said because they were scared. Okay? We included an answer about legal concerns. So 9% of people said because they of legal concerns, even though we don't think there are really legal concerns of jumping the firewall at this time. There might be a little bit more today. 14% said it was too bothersome, and 15% said they didn't know how. So this is really a friction story, right? That it was just too annoying to jump the firewall. They didn't actually know how to do it. And then 45% of people said that they had no reason to jump the firewall. Okay? And there were some people who also didn't give any answer. So a lot of people here are just saying, you know, this is too annoying. This is makes me go too far out of my way. This is really a story about friction, about the fact that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They couldn't give multiple responses?
No, they only had to choose one, yeah. So you might say, well, this is a survey. You know, we have a lot of problems with surveys, like people might not respond truthfully, or you know, we might not be, you know, being either face-to-face. They might not want to actually give an answer that it's actually true. So you can also look at this through looking at geolocated social media posts. So I'm going to use these a lot throughout the rest of the talk. So geolocated social media posts, I'm going to grab a whole bunch of these in the September of 2014. In China and on Twitter and on the Chinese version of Twitter as well. So at first, I'm just going to use a random sample of all geolocated tweets from China. And this is about 1/3 of all geolocated tweets. So geolocated tweets are about 3% of the Twitter stream. And this, I'm going to get about 1/3 of those, so maybe 1% of the Twitter sample. And the innovation here is that geolocation, when you're on your phone in China, and most people in China use the internet on their phone, if you geolocate, you're going to use the GPS on your phone. You're not going to use the IP. So if you're on a VPN, even though you're masking your IP, your geolocation of your social media post is actually where you are, okay? So what this means is that you can measure some dynamics of Great Firewall evasion, because if somebody is on Twitter, which has been blocked in China since 2009, and they are geolocating to China, you have a pretty good reason to believe that they are evading the firewall, okay? So we get about, from this random sample of geolocated tweets, we get about 1,700 users per day from mainland China, and we're just going to do a really broad back-of-the-envelope calculation with a lot of assumptions, is that maybe that's about 170,000 total users if you think we have 1% of the Twitter sample, okay? This is a generalization, because we know that geolocated tweets aren't a representative sample. But then we can compare this to Hong Kong, where it is not affected by the firewall, and we get about 905 users per day from Hong Kong. Okay? So if we multiply that by 100, we get about 90,000 total users per day, maybe tweeting from Hong Kong. And the back of the envelope calculation is that means that about 1.7% of Hong Kong internet users are participating every day on Twitter, and about 0.02% of Chinese internet users, which is about 1 to 2% of users in China as compared to Hong Kong, okay? So this on the back of the envelope, that's pretty similar also than what we're getting from the survey, is that there are many, many fewer Twitter users tweeting to China than there are to Hong Kong, and so we might think that this is really similar to the results we're getting in the survey. Yeah?
Did the government authorize this study because they had approved their censorship policy?
The survey it was done in collaboration with a university. Yeah. So, yeah, in that sense. Yeah. So this data is all collected from the Twitter API. Yeah. So if you do a comparison between Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter, and Twitter, and you look at the distribution, so these are all I'm going to show you geolocated tweets on Weibo in the same geographic area around Beijing as Twitter, okay? And this is sampled to the same number of geolocated posts. And what we see is that on Weibo, you get a lot of people are tweeting from Beijing and Tianjin, which are the two big cities in this area. But you also have a lot of people tweeting in the other areas in between the big cities, right? And in sort of more minor cities around it. But on Twitter, you see that most of the geolocation activity is happening in urban areas, like we see in this survey. Most people are in the major cities and not in sort of the rural areas. You also see, so if we look at, just take these tweets sampled in the same time period in the exact same location, and we look at the differences in the textual content between these two tweets, we also get an idea of the different communities that are on these two different platforms. So I'm going to use the structural topic model, which is the model I developed that basically takes the latent density allocation and includes contextual information to estimate how differences in topics between two populations, okay? And I know Brandon Stewart was here a few months ago, so I'm just going to go through this really briefly, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want more. But basically, what we do is we take the latent density allocation, and we include a topical prevalence. We include a covariate on the prior of the theta matrix, which is the document topic proportions. which allows you to estimate how the amount of posts that talk about a topic are different between Weibo and Twitter in this case. So how are the topics different between these two communities? And so we just add a logistic normal with a covariate of whether or not somebody's on Weibo and Twitter, and estimate the coefficient on the topic document portion in LDA. So that's a theta matrix from LDA. And you can also, in the STM, you can allow topical content to vary by metadata. So you can basically add a covariate on the way in which somebody talks about something, and if that's different between Weibo and Twitter. And we estimate this by a variational EM, and we've shown in other work that sort of including these types of covariates really improves the topic model so that you can get more accurate estimation, and you can also get better qualitative interpretability through this topic model. So here's, we can talk more a little bit about this in the Q&A if you want to talk about the model. But basically what I'm just going to show you is that I'm going to show you the topics that are most different between Twitter, which is blocked in China, and Weibo, which is the Chinese version of Twitter. And we see that it really lines up a lot with the survey results. So that this is the difference in topic proportions. These are the 4 topics that are most associated with Twitter, which is blocked in China. First topic is I'm in Beijing or Tianjin. So that makes sense. If you look at that the geography, right? People are saying about Beijing and Tianjin. But also technology. So people on Twitter in China are talking a lot about technology. And they're really tech savvy, very highly educated, right? And people are also talking a lot about education and university. They're young and they're really well educated. And they're also talking, and this is during the time period of the Hong Kong protests in September 2014, so they're also talking a lot more about politics than they are on Weibo. If you look at topics that are most associated with Weibo, they're actually what people always talk about on the internet around the world, which is celebrities. So this first topic is about rooting for star Wei Chen, who's on like a award show. So they were talking about, good way to go, Wei Chen. What I did today, the weather, and life advice. Okay. So if you look at this distribution on Weibo, what you see is that you're getting a different type of person than on Chinese Twitter, where people have to jump the firewall to actually participate, right? So there's the firewall might be only getting a certain type of person across it, and these types of people are engaging on Twitter, which is blocked in China, and the rest of people are sort of engaging on Weibo, which is not blocked in China.
Very much the same with universities, right? In Beijing and Tianjin is where you have the universities, in
Exactly.
Beijing, Nankai, and Tianjin University.
Yeah, so you do have a lot of universities in this area, and you're also just more urban areas generally. Even if you look at across the country, more urban areas are much more likely to have geolocated posts on Twitter, which is blocked. So I'm trying to just to paint a descriptive picture of the types of people who jump the firewall. But do we actually know that this is like an effect of the firewall, right? So we know that sort of certain types of people are pulled across the firewall to engage on Twitter. But can we actually say that the firewall has an impact on how people engage with the internet, okay? So I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of dynamic effects of the Great Firewall on internet traffic in China, and try to convince you just outside of this descriptive picture that the Great Firewall has a big impact on internet traffic and rerouting people. Okay? So the first I'm just going to show you, this is just from Google data. This is the proportion of Google traffic from China on the y-axis, and this is from 2010 to 2015. And what we see is that Google has had a really fraught relationship with the Chinese government. In 2010, Google alleged that the Chinese had hacked the Google site and decided to stop censoring their search and redirected instead to the Hong Kong page, which was uncensored. And then the Chinese government decided to throttle Google for actually many years. So Google would only load a certain percentage of the time. So this is very much a friction strategy, right? But I had been to China several times during this time period, and it was really annoying. Your email only loads a certain amount of the time. It's very frustrating to get work done, right? And this really decreases internet traffic very suddenly, even just throttling. And then finally, there was a sort of a permanent block before the June 4th anniversary in 2014, where Google traffic almost goes completely to zero from China. We also see this in another website that we have data from, which has also had a fraught relationship with the Chinese government, which is Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has usually, before 2015, only certain pages of Chinese Wikipedia were blocked by the Chinese government. Only sensitive pages of Chinese Wikipedia were blocked, like about Tiananmen Square or about leaders, et cetera. But in May of 2015, Wikipedia decided to switch to a fully encrypted website. And therefore, the Chinese government decided to block the entire Wikipedia on May 19th of 2015. And you can actually see the hour that Wikipedia was blocked by looking at total Chinese language page views that you can get just from the Wikipedia API. And so this shows that you have about 14 million page views. These don't all come from China, but a lot of them do. And then on May 19th, when Wikipedia was blocked, there's a huge decrease in the number, it almost halves the number of page views just from the block of the firewall. So the firewall has really big effects on internet traffic overnight, within minutes, on the number of people accessing a website. Just sort of, so friction is really effective at rerouting people to other types of information. Okay. So hopefully I've convinced you that friction is effective at making big changes in internet traffic, and also hopefully provided some descriptive evidence to show that there's a different type of person that tends to decide to evade censorship, and tends to decide not to evade censorship and decide, or doesn't have the tools necessarily to evade censorship and jump the firewall. So friction, in a sense, relies on sort of the indifference and impatience of internet users, that people sort of are willing to switch to a different page or to do something else on the internet and not to try to seek out ways to get around it. And this is facilitated by sort of an easy switch to substitute. So in the Wikipedia case, there is an alternative website, Baidu that people can use instead of Wikipedia. And in Google case, you can use Baidu, which is really similar. So you could just switch to a different website instead of trying to get around the firewall and jump through all these hoops in order to continue to see something. It also relies sort of on the low visibility of censorship. So Google was throttled for a long time, so it was just really slow. So it was really difficult to sort of know whether or not it was like a technical problem or it was the government doing it, et cetera, unless you were really following all of the developments. So there are some exceptions to this strategy, and the exceptions, there are time periods when the strategy backfires. So there are certain events like crises, and I'll give you an example of this in the Tianjin explosion in 2015, and also sudden censorship disruptions that are really visible and that don't have substitutes. So I'm going to give you an example of the Instagram block in 2014, where this method of friction can sort of backfire against the government. So in a sense, that friction works really well, that I've just showed you is a little bit obvious, like that if you block a website, you can't get around it. But I think that these exceptions also show sort of when it breaks down or when there are time periods where it doesn't work. So the Tianjin explosion in 2015 was a large explosion at a chemical plant in Tianjin in August of 2015. And so what happened is this huge explosion. This is the picture of it in the middle of a city. Right? It was a really tragic event. 173 people were killed. There were hundreds of people injured. It was also very visible. People who were videoing it in real time on social media. There was a lot of confusion in the aftermath of what happened, as you can imagine. If there's a huge explosion in your city, it's very, very disorienting. The survey that was in the field before and after the explosion, and sort of the largest difference between the people surveyed before and after the explosion was their use of VPNs. Okay? And so this is the proportion of internet users who jumped the firewall on the y-axis. There's the explosion, and there were two different waves of the survey. And these dots are the sort of different communities that were surveyed, and the size of the dot is relative to the population of that geosampled community. And what we see is that there's a sort of a much higher proportion of people who are using VPNs after the explosion relative to before. And then no matter sort of what you control for in this is this sort of about 20 percentage points increase doesn't really go away. So that's just a really big effect of the explosion, or what we think might be an effect of the explosion on the use of VPN. So it could be that in crisis situations, people are willing to sort of get around censorship in order to seek out access to information. The other example is the Instagram block, which happened on September 29th of 2014. So on September 29th of 2014, Instagram, and I don't know how many of you guys know what Instagram is, but this is its most followed person on Instagram is Selena Gomez. And here she has this like selfie, has like 9 million likes, okay? So 9 million people liked this picture on Instagram. Instagram is a popular photo sharing application owned by Facebook. It has 600 million users worldwide, about 4.2 billion likes per day, so people interact with this by liking the photos. And 80% of its users are outside of the United States. There are tons of people who are using Instagram outside of the United States. And starting in 2011, we know that there are about 100,000 downloads from China per week, but I don't know during 2014 exactly how many users were on Instagram in China. We just think there were a lot, okay? Instagram was suddenly blocked by the Great Firewall on September 29th of 2014. This was the third day of the protests in Hong Kong, the sort of umbrella revolution. You guys might have seen about this in the news, where people were protesting against sort of Beijing interference in Hong Kong elections. Okay? So we looked at geolocated social media posts from Instagram. So we sampled from a grid of China. We sampled points in proportion to population on this grid. And then we collected all posts within a certain radius with all of these points. And we looked at so we got probably we think is a less than 1% sample of people posting on Instagram from China. But if we looked at the number of unique geolocated Instagram users from September 1st to October 31st, where September 29th was the Instagram block, what we see is that the Instagram block really decreased the number of people geolocating to China on Instagram, which is not surprising. It's very consistent with the results I showed you before. But about 53% of people continued to use Instagram, even though of the block. So these people could have already had VPNs and already been evading the firewall, but what we see is that actually VPNs became extremely popular in China overnight because of the Instagram block. So this is data from App Annie, which is an application statistic website. And this is the iPhone application rank of 2 of the most popular VPN applications in China. We see as VPN applications went from 1600th most popular, this is on a log scale, to almost top 10 overnight. So all of a sudden, VPNs became incredibly popular in China overnight, and not on the first day of the Hong Kong protests, on the third day of the Hong Kong protests, right when Instagram got blocked, okay? What we see, though, is that this backfires because even though there are fewer people using Instagram, all of a sudden they download a VPN and all of this other long blocked information is now available. So this is a gateway. The Instagram block becomes a gateway into many other types of information that have long been blocked in China. So if we look at that same geolocated sample of Twitter users within China, what we see is that Hong Kong Twitter users, the number of unique users we have in our sample in Hong Kong in the week before and after the block stays about the same. But then in China, mainland China, the number of Twitter users geolocating to Twitter jumps almost by 2/3 during on the day of the Instagram block. And we see that this is mostly driven by all of these new users who signed up for Twitter on the day of the Instagram block. So what happened basically, and these new users on Twitter are sort of less likely to be geolocated to Beijing and Shanghai. They're more likely to come from rural areas. They're more likely to, they initially follow celebrities. They're not as interested in politics at first. And they also don't tend to talk about politics in Hong Kong at first. They talk not as much as typical users. So they mostly talk about sort of daily life and celebrities. They're more your typical internet user who's using Instagram, goes across the wall because they want to continue to use Instagram, and then they sign up for Twitter, and they sort of engage with the Twitter community, even though they have never done that before. So there's one of the Twitter users says their first tweet was, today, China's not on Instagram, so I downloaded something and tried Twitter, and as a result, I can pay attention to Justin Bieber. That was their first tweet. So basically, the Instagram block, because people are so addicted to Instagram and it was so sudden, unlike Google, which was throttled slowly for a long time, they are drawn across the wall, download a VPN, and then they get access to Twitter. And we see higher downloads of Facebook on that day. We also see that Wikipedia blocked views of Wikipedia pages. So we figured out all of the pages on this day that were blocked. And we see that the number of times that these pages were viewed went up on Chinese Wikipedia, went up drastically on the day of the Instagram block. So interestingly, what we see from this is that there are time periods when, even though there's this friction, there's this firewall, that a crisis or sudden censorship of something that has few substitutes can actually draw people. There are time periods when people are willing to get around this type of friction. And these are often time periods when the government, during a crisis, or in this case, the Hong Kong protests, when the government needs it most. Yeah?
When does it go back to normal?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So it's interesting when you look at, I have data on like Facebook and Wikipedia, Twitter, and a lot of different stuff here. And they all sort of decrease after the Instagram block. So part of this is that the Chinese government upgraded the firewall about a month after the Instagram block. And so they made the firewall harder to evade, and I think part of it was a reaction to this. But also that Wikipedia is something where maybe there were a few things you wanted to look at, and then you've kind of gotten that information, and you don't need to continue to get that information. So unlike Twitter, which actually decreases a lot more slowly, you see Wikipedia is something maybe you look at once. And a lot of the pages here that got the biggest spike around the Instagram block were pages about the 1989 Tiananmen crisis, which you kind of get that information and maybe you don't look at it again. I think that's part of it. So interestingly, we don't see this same increase in VPN popularity for the other blocks that I talked about. We only see it for the Instagram block. So here is the VPN Express iPhone rank. And we see maybe like a delayed increase from the Google block. But Google had already been throttled for 3 years. And so there wasn't really, people had mostly already switched to different to Baidu or another unblocked website. Instagram block, we see a huge spike on the day of the Instagram block in VPN population. And then Wikipedia, we don't see that spike either. So my hypothesis, although what I'm working on now is trying to look at many more of these blocks around the world and trying to understand these dynamics, is that there's something about the suddenness of the Instagram block and also the unavailability of substitutes that makes this a particularly block that tends to backfire against the government. So how does China maintain one of sort of the most vibrant online communities while still repressing it? The answer that I put forward in the book is that they distract and divert. They use friction and flooding to reroute users to other information. So the Great Firewall is a good example of this. It really changes how people are using the internet. It changes the types of people that are on websites. It changes internet traffic suddenly with one block because people are easily switched to substitutes and they're not either don't know or they're not willing to spend the time to sort of get around it. It separates out masses from the activists, so it pulls a different type of person into blocked websites than your normal internet user. And it censors while reducing the perception of censorship. So particularly when the Great Firewall is used to throttle information, it's kind of unclear. There isn't really any information about why something went down. But the Achilles heel of this strategy, so the Achilles heel of using inconvenience to reroute people on the internet, is that there are some time periods where people are willing to search out information, for example, during crises or during sudden, more visible censorship like the Instagram block. So the takeaway from the book is that censorship is much more than fear. So censorship, I think, especially in our context, we often think about censorship as freedom to say anything you want or read anything you want. But in the book, I argue that censorship is not only punishment, but it's also putting small barriers to access from information that tend to really reroute people online. And censorship also has a very unequal impact. So there's a lot of work in social science that talks about the digital divide, the fact that there are some people are more able to use the internet and therefore gain that advantage, whereas sort of poorer people or less educated people are not. And censorship exacerbates this digital divide because not only do you have this divide in internet access, you also have a divide in how people know how to get around the internet, right? And that makes, and this makes the divide even more stark, I think, than it would otherwise. And I also, the book puts forward sort of a broader definition of censorship that has implications for democracies. So one of the, I think in democracies, we often think of freedom of information as freedom to say whatever you want without punishment. But as it becomes more and more important of what is at the top of the pile, we have so much information that what is at the top of the information pile matters as much as whether or not you have the right to say anything, right? That now I think there's a broader definition that we have to think of censorship as not only having information as one website in a billion, but also how information is organized or ordered for people. So there's something to think about. So thanks so much, and for more information or papers, you can visit my website. And I'm looking forward to any questions or comments you have. Yeah.
Two questions. One is there any policy prescriptions that come out of this research? So what can one do to fight censorship?
Yeah, so interestingly, so it's really, so what you want is to decrease friction, right? And the way to decrease friction is to give people more access to evasion technology, right? So you could imagine that would be one approach. Interestingly, another, I think, really cool implication is that automated translation technology is actually an anti-censorship technology, because one of the things that the Chinese government relies on extensively is the fact that a lot of people aren't able to speak English, and so they don't have to block a whole bunch of, so for example, English Wikipedia hasn't been blocked. But as more and more automated translation software becomes useful, that small friction, that natural friction of translation becomes easier to get around. And so I think that that's those types of technologies, any technology that reduces friction of access to information is something that it would be important to be developed. And it would be interesting to study how that influences people's knowledge or access to information in the future.
And my second question is, have you looked at other places, like, for example, in Iran? Because I would imagine things are a little bit different there.
Yeah.
I have personal knowledge a little bit about this, that there's, first of all, the lines are not clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this is by design.
Right.
So by making the line fluid,
Right.
it makes it harder for you to get close to it.
Yeah.
And so you don't know, there's a bit of a randomness into where the line is. That's one. And the second thing is people's lives depend a lot more on politics than China. So a lot more people would actually try to jump over the firewall. So
That's interesting. Yeah, so I have looked at data on Iran, and there seems to be a lot more censorship evasion. On average, there's more censorship evasion. I think part of that is what you were saying, that people are more interested in politics maybe, but also that it's a smaller country, and so there aren't as many alternatives necessarily. So in China, you have a Chinese Facebook, you have Chinese Twitter, you have WeChat, which is like better than all of our social media. It's like really, really great. And so there are all of these other alternatives that you don't need to use. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you share more details on how the survey was conducted?
Yeah, so the survey is done through geo sampling. So there were cities were sampled around China, and then within those cities, there was, so the problem, you can't use like random addresses or phone numbers because there's a big migrant population, right? So you want to kind of get everyone. And so then you're geo sampled within the cities. There is like a random sampling of places, and then within that, you would sort of sample households within a certain radius. So it's like a cluster geo.
The survey you did on social media, right? The first one, right?
Oh, that's a face-to-face survey. It's not on social media. Yeah, that's a face-to-face survey. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a really interesting talk.
Thanks.
So I have two questions. The first is with respect to the price was drawn events where more citizens would jump the internet. I wonder if there's a general description or characteristics for the kinds of crises that would trigger these internet citizens to jump the wall. In particular, the child abuse allegation at different kindergartens. That kind of trigger this sudden flood of people jumping the internet. The second question is, now that it's a lot harder to get VPNs in mainland China, I wonder if the number of VPN downloads is still a good proxy for your research, or how do you plan on carrying on your research from this point on?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. I would assume that it would be really interesting to look at different events and to try to understand how firewall evasion changed from different events. I think that cases where people would assume that the foreign media has good information would be cases where people would try to evade the firewall in order to get that information. And also cities and areas, so Tianjin is one of these, where there are networks, a lot of people are sort of already using the firewall, so there are networks that sort of facilitate that, I think would also be places. I think it's true, so the environment in China has changed, so the VPNs are less sort of available or much more difficult to use. And I think one of so here I was using app Annie. You can still follow VPN downloads on that app, but the thing is people switch to different VPNs quickly. So these VPNs are no longer relevant as much as other VPNs, right? And so you have to sort of try to, and even that switching I think is interesting and you could study, right? You could understand how people sort of switch to different, as it's like a whack-a-mole. So yeah, I think that's both really interesting questions. Yes?
Thank you. Do you have any, at least anecdotal evidence about how people learn about how to use VPNs and what evasion strategies do they use? Is it something like if they hear, oh, you should use a VPN, so I'm going to search for VPN on the App Store and use what I find? Or are there more detailed guides that are passed down locally, or is it some hybrid of the two, or something else?
Yeah, so this I think would be a really fascinating social network study, is to understand how people who have certain knowledge of VPNs and during these sort of events where people are asking about how to use a VPN, do they seek out that information? How does having a connection to someone who does know how does that influence your propensity to then use it? I think those would be really interesting questions to study and something I want to follow up on in the future. I also think the App Store is a really important aspect of that, and this was before the block of the VPNs in the Apple App Store. And so after the block, I think you would have have less facilitation with the App Store in doing this, yeah. Yes?
The mechanisms that you described of real fiction and distraction, are they like the innovation in the information technology era, or do you think they were in place before that, before internet and information become very spread out?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that all three have been in place for a very long time. You can actually look at there are lots and lots of examples of friction in many countries throughout time. But I think that the internet has made friction and flooding relatively more useful than fear. So that what the internet has done is a whole bunch more people are now online, right? So it's much more difficult to use fear because you have to legitimately threaten a lot more people than maybe in the media before, where you just have a few journalists or influencers you have to target. And then you can use friction really because there's so many substitutes on the internet, right? It's a lot easier for people to switch to something else. And in fact, there's a lot of internet research about how people switch all the time. When they're on their phone, you switch between things 15 times a minute or something crazy like that. And so friction is you have really high elasticity of information, if you can think about it that way. And so then you're really easy if something's just a little bit more costly or taking a little bit longer, you just switch a lot quicker on the internet than maybe you did before, where you've already checked this book out from the library, or you're already gone to the library. Right now, you want to find whatever you're interested in. So I think that there are different sort of considerations in the social media age for censorship than it used to be. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks. Is there any possibility that like tweets with geolocated information and without geolocated information might differ in the content-wise?
Oh, totally, yes. And I think that's, we use what we can to study this, right? But of course, geolocated tweets are not representative of all of Twitter. And so mostly we're trying to use it to study dynamics, right? So big changes that happen suddenly. And I did a back of the envelope calculation that obviously is really rough. But certainly geolocated information is going to be different. So to do that, to sort of in the paper on sudden censorship to make sure that we don't get completely soaked in by this geolocation problem is that page views of Chinese Wikipedia are not geolocated. Those are all page views of all of the page views of Chinese Wikipedia. We also use followers of Twitter users, which are not all geolocated. So we just grab lists of followers before and after the Instagram block. And there are many, many more followers of Chinese Twitter users because of the Instagram block. I think for 2,000 random sample users, we estimated there were 33,000 more followers for those users. So there are a lot more people. So we tried to get around that by trying not to rely completely on geolocation. Yeah.
Okay, so we are out of time, but then I'm sure that Molly will be happy to entertain questions in the reception that we have now at Dreyfus Building, 6th floor, Leeds area. But let's say again, thanks.
Thank you guys.